The August air in Stone Mountain, Georgia, was thick enough to drink, a suffocating cocktail of humidity, pine needles, and the ghosts of history. It clung to the skin like a shroud, promising a thunderstorm that never came. Inside the modest, single-story home, on a street named after a Confederate general, the air was even heavier, choked with the metallic tang of blood and the sterile sting of bleach. This was where the dream of Amara Jenkins, 17 years old and shimmering with the promise of a future far beyond this sleepy subdivision, had come to a violent, silent end. The first officer on the scene had called it in as a possible suicide. It was a neat, convenient label for a tragedy they saw too often. A young black girl, a bathtub filled with crimson-tinted water, an empty bottle of pills resting artfully on the tiled floor. But to Detective Isabella Rossi, the scene screamed of a lie. Rossi was new to the DeKalb County PD, a transplant from Philadelphia with eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for treating every case like a personal insult. Her partner, Detective Miles Davis, a man who had seen the soul of this county curdle over 25 years of service, felt it too. He stood in the doorway of the bathroom, his large frame blocking the light, his expression a mask of weary resignation. The scene was a contradiction, a meticulously crafted piece of chaos. The water in the tub was cold, suggesting hours had passed. Yet, the steam from a recent shower still fogged a corner of the mirror that wasn't shattered. Amara Jenkins floated in the stillness, her face turned towards the ceiling, her eyes open in a final, vacant surprise. Her long braids, usually adorned with colorful beads, fanned out around her head like a dark halo. The water wasn't deep enough to drown in, and the pills on the floor were simple ibuprofen. It was sloppy. Insultingly sloppy. "This is performance art, not a suicide," Rossi muttered, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the oppressive quiet. Davis grunted in agreement. "A bad one at that? Look at her neck." Rossi leaned closer. Beneath the dark skin, almost invisible at first glance, was a constellation of faint bruises, the telltale sign of petechiae in her eyes, the hallmark of asphyxiation. This girl hadn't swallowed pills. She had fought for her last breath. Rossi's gaze swept the room, cataloging the details. The shattered mirror, the overturned shampoo bottles, the frantic disarray. It all pointed to a struggle, but one detail snagged her attention, a tiny glint of gold near the drain. Using a pair of tweezers, she carefully fished it out. It was a broken clasp from a delicate necklace, one half of it still clinging to a fine chain. The other half was missing. It was the first loose thread in a story someone had desperately tried to stitch shut. They moved from the bathroom into the rest of the house. It was a home suffocating under the weight of trying too hard. The furniture was dated but obsessively clean. Plastic runners protected the beige carpet. Framed Bible verses adorned the walls, offering silent, hollow promises of peace and salvation. In Amara's room, the contrast was stark. Posters of Beyoncé and Kendrick Lamar fought for space with an honor roll certificate and a debate club trophy. Books on law and social justice were stacked neatly on her desk next to a well-worn copy of the King James Bible. This was the room of a girl with one foot in the world she was given and the other striding toward the world she wanted, a world she would now never reach. The initial interviews took place on the front porch, as the crime scene unit methodically dismantled the family's life inside. The cicadas buzzed in a frantic rising crescendo, nature's own Greek chorus to the unfolding tragedy. The humid air was now thick with a new tension, the palpable friction of race and authority. Stone Mountain was a place where the past was never truly past, and the sight of a white detective questioning a grieving black family was a tableau laden with centuries of distrust. Rossi was acutely aware of it, the weight of her skin color in this specific place, at this specific time. She chose her words carefully, her tone measured and respectful, but she could feel the invisible walls going up. Davis, on the other hand, navigated these treacherous waters with an innate understanding. He spoke in a low, soothing cadence, his presence a bridge between two worlds that rarely met on equal terms. He understood the coded language, the guarded expressions, the deep-seated fear of a system that had, for generations, failed people who looked like him. He saw the neighbors peering from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of fear and suspicion. They weren't just mourning a lost child, They were bracing for the storm that always followed when police lights flashed on their streets. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawn, the medical examiner's van pulled away, taking Amara with it. The silence she left behind was profound, a vacuum where a vibrant life used to be. Rossi stood by her unmarked sedan, the broken clasp in an evidence bag feeling heavy in her hand. It was a tiny, insignificant object, yet it felt like the key. A key to a door someone had not only locked, but had tried to wall over completely. She looked at the house, its windows now dark and empty, and a cold certainty settled in her gut. This wasn't just a murder, this was an execution, and the killer was not a stranger who had broken in. They were someone who knew which Bible verses to hang on the wall. The first mini-hook was set. Who broke the necklace? And why was a scene of such violence so poorly disguised as an act of despair? The answer, Rossi suspected, was waiting inside the very sanctuary this family called home. The interrogation room at the DeKalb County Precinct was a sterile, soulless box designed to strip away comfort and pretense. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation. It was here, under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights, that Detectives Rossi and Davis first sat down with Brenda Jenkins, Amara's mother. She was a small, bird-like woman, swallowed by a borrowed police department blanket draped over her shoulders. Her grief was a physical force, a storm of shuddering sobs and breathless gasps that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand, her knuckles white. "My baby! Who would do this to my baby girl?" she wailed, her voice cracking. She was a good girl. She was going to be a lawyer. She was going to change the world. Rossi offered quiet, practiced words of condolence, her pen poised over her notebook. She asked the standard questions. When did you last see her? Did she seem upset? Was she having trouble with anyone? Brenda's answers were buried in avalanches of tears. She claimed she had last seen Amara the previous morning, before leaving for her double shift as a certified nursing assistant at a nearby assisted living facility. She'd worked straight through, she insisted, exhausted, only to be woken by the most horrific phone call of her life. Detective Davis sat back in his chair, his hands clasped over his stomach, observing. He'd seen grief in all its forms, raw, explosive, silent, and performative, and something about Brenda's sorrow felt rehearsed. It was a grand theatrical display, yet her eyes, in the brief moments between sobs, were sharp and scanning, assessing their reactions. He noted how she repeated the phrase, "my baby girl," like a mantra, a shield. He'd learned long ago that the loudest grief wasn't always the most genuine. Sometimes it was just the opposite, a smokescreen designed to hide something else entirely. An hour later, they sat across from Amara's stepfather, Pastor Marcus Thorne. If Brenda's grief was a tempest, his was a chilling, unnerving calm. He was a handsome, charismatic man in his late 50s, the kind of man who commanded respect with his mere presence. His salt and pepper hair was impeccably groomed, his suit perfectly pressed. Even at this ungodly hour, he was the spiritual leader of one of Stone Mountain's largest and most influential black churches, a pillar of the community whose sermons on love and forgiveness drew hundreds every Sunday. Right now, however, he looked less like a grieving father and more like a man carved from stone. He didn't cry. His hands rested calmly on the metal table, his posture erect. He spoke in the same deep, resonant voice he likely used from the pulpit, his words measured and deliberate. "This is a test from the Lord," he stated, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just above Rossi's head. "A trial to test our faith. Amara has been called home to glory." Rossi felt a prickle of unease. His detachment was profoundly jarring. "Pastor Thorne," she began, her tone gentle but firm, "we need to understand what happened. Can you tell us about your movements last night?" His alibi was delivered with the same unnerving composure. He had been at the church until 10:30 p.m., he explained, in a private Bible study and counseling session with a deacon, a man named Elvin Hayes. It was a regular Tuesday night occurrence. He'd arrived home around 11 p.m. to a dark, quiet house. He assumed Amara was either asleep or had stayed over at a friend's house, which she sometimes did. He'd gone straight to bed, he said, unaware of the horror that had unfolded just one room away. The story was clean, almost too clean. Davis leaned forward, breaking his silence. A man finds out his stepdaughter is dead, and the first thing he talks about is a test from the Lord. His voice was low, but it held an edge that cut through the pastor's manufactured serenity. You didn't check on her? You didn't think it was strange the house was so quiet? For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, anger, crossed the pastor's face before being swiftly extinguished. "Detective," he said, his tone dropping a degree, "I am a man of faith. My ways of processing grief may not align with yours. I put my trust in God's plan, however painful." He never once referred to Amara as his daughter. It was always Amara, a name, not a relationship. As they left the interrogation room, the contrast between the mother and stepfather was a blaring alarm in Rossi's mind. One, a torrent of emotion that felt slightly off-key. The other, a vacuum of it that felt fundamentally wrong. They were two sides of a coin, a polarized depiction of grief that didn't add up. "The deacon, Elvin Hayes," Rossi said, flipping through her notes as they walked down the hallway. "We need to talk to him. Yesterday." "We will," Davis replied, his brow furrowed in thought. "But that alibi feels ironclad. A man of God and his deacon. Who's going to argue with that?" He paused, turning to face her. "Tell me something, Rossi. You ever meet a man who was too calm? So calm it makes the hair on your arms stand up?" Rossi nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I was thinking." "Something ain't right with that preacher," Davis murmured, more to himself than to her. "And the wife, she cried a river, but I'm not sure a single tear was real." They had the parents' statements, two seemingly solid alibis that placed them far from the scene of the crime at the presumed time of death. But the detectives were left with a profound sense of unease. The family portrait was fractured, the emotions discordant. This mini-hook was a question of authenticity. Was this the grief of innocent parents, or the carefully constructed performance of the guilty ones? The foundation of the investigation rested on finding the truth behind the tears and the silence, and both felt like lies. In the pressure cooker environment of a high-profile murder investigation, the path of least resistance is often the most tempting. And in Stone Mountain, Georgia, that path almost always led to a young black man. The media, catching the scent of blood in the water, descended on the case with a predictable, ravenous hunger. Within 48 hours, Amara Jenkins was no longer just a victim. She was a narrative, and every narrative needs a villain. The spotlight, guided by a subtle but pervasive institutional bias, swiveled and landed squarely on Jamal Carter. Jamal was, by all accounts, the golden boy of his high school. As the star quarterback, he possessed a potent combination of athletic grace and quiet charisma that had already attracted scouts from several Division Ewing colleges. He was Amara's boyfriend of 2 years, the handsome, popular athlete paired with the brilliant, ambitious scholar. On the surface, they were the perfect couple. But now, seen through the distorted lens of a murder investigation, their story was being systematically rewritten. Local news reports, citing unnamed police sources, began painting a new picture of Jamal. He was described as intensely passionate and possessive. A minor argument they had had in the school hallway 2 months prior was suddenly reframed as a history of volatility. The narrative was insidious and familiar, the promising young black athlete with a hidden, violent temper. It didn't matter that his coaches described him as a disciplined leader, or that his teachers called him respectful. The shadow of prejudice was long, and it was quickly eclipsing the truth. The pressure came down from the top. The police captain, a man with mayoral ambitions and a keen sense of public relations, wanted a fast arrest. "The media is running wild with this," he'd barked at Rossi and Davis in his office. "A grieving mother, a respected pastor. The community wants answers. Find the boyfriend. Lean on him. These things are almost always the boyfriend." Rossi bristled. "We have no physical evidence linking him to the scene, Captain," she countered. "His preliminary alibi is solid." "Then break it," the captain snapped, his patience worn thin. "This is how the game is played." Davis stood silently by the door, his face impassive. He had seen this game played out hundreds of times over his career. He knew the rules, and he knew who always lost. Jamal Carter was brought in for a formal interrogation. He sat in the same cold gray room where Amara's parents had been. But the atmosphere was different. The pretense of empathy was gone, replaced by a palpable air of accusation. Jamal, barely 18, tried to hold on to his composure, but his fear was evident in the tremor in his hands and the slight quaver in his voice. He loved Amara, he insisted, his eyes welling with genuine tears. He would never, ever hurt her. His alibi was straightforward and verifiable. On the night of the murder, he was at football practice until 8 p.m., a fact confirmed by 3 coaches and 50 teammates. Afterwards, he and a group of friends went to a local diner, a popular hangout spot. They stayed until just after 11 p.m. The diner was packed and multiple witnesses saw him there. More importantly, the diner's security camera footage, time-stamped and clear, showed him at a booth, laughing with his friends, during the entire window of time the ME had estimated for Amara's death. "The camera doesn't lie," Rossi told the captain, slapping the file on his desk. "His alibi is airtight. He wasn't there." The captain was unmoved. "So he hired someone. Or the ME's timeline is off. Keep him. Hold him for the full 48 hours. Let's see if the pressure makes him change his story." For Rossi, it was an infuriating directive that reeked of lazy policing and racial profiling. For Davis, it was a depressingly familiar script. He watched as they put Jamal in a holding cell, a promising young man whose life was now being irrevocably damaged by the very system sworn to protect him. The arrest inflamed the community. Jamal's family, outraged and terrified, hired a lawyer. Local activists began organizing, accusing the department of rushing to judgment and targeting a black teen to close a case quickly. The fault lines in Stone Mountain began to tremble. Back in their shared office, the tension between the partners was thick. "This is wrong, Miles," Rossi fumed, pacing the small space. "We're wasting time on a kid with a rock-solid alibi while the real killer is out there." Davis leaned back in his squeaky chair, his eyes heavy. "Welcome to Georgia, detective," he said, his voice devoid of humor. "You wanted to know how the game is played. This is it. They find the easiest target, the one people are already conditioned to believe is guilty, and they squeeze. Doesn't matter what the evidence says. It's about perception." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "But you and I know he didn't do it, which means we have to look back at the people no one wants to suspect." The mini-hook was now a moral and procedural dilemma. With an innocent young man in a holding cell and a community on the verge of erupting, the pressure was immense. But Jamal, in his frightened but fierce denial, had planted a crucial seed of doubt. During the interrogation, he had said something that now echoed in Rossi's mind. "Amara was scared lately," he'd whispered, his voice thick with a pain that went beyond grief. "But she wasn't scared of me. She was scared of something in that house." The investigation had been deliberately pointed away from the family home, but now every instinct told the detectives that the shadow of prejudice was distracting them from the real darkness that lurked behind its closed doors. The DeKalb County Medical Examiner's Office was a place where the dead told their secrets. It was a world of cold steel, chemical scents, and the quiet, methodical search for truth in human tissue. Dr. Lena Horowitz, the chief ME, was a woman who preferred the company of the silent to the living. She was pragmatic, unsentimental, and brilliant. When she called Detectives Rossi and Davis down to her lab, her voice on the phone held a note of urgency that cut through the morning's bureaucratic haze. "You're going to want to see this in person," she'd said before hanging up. The autopsy room was chilly, as always. Amara Jenkins lay on a steel table, her body covered by a sterile white sheet. The vibrant, ambitious girl was gone, replaced by the cold, clinical reality of a case file. Dr. Horowitz, a small woman with sharp, intelligent eyes behind her glasses, stood waiting for them. She wasted no time on pleasantries. "Your victim was strangled, as you suspected," she began, gesturing towards a large monitor displaying X-rays and toxicology reports. "The force was significant. The hyoid bone is fractured. It was a brutal personal attack. The bruises on her arms and torso confirm a violent struggle. This much they already knew. It confirmed their theory of a homicide, but it didn't move the case forward." "What else you got for us, Lena?" Davis asked, his tone patient. Dr. Horowitz took a deep breath, the kind a person takes before delivering news that will change everything. She picked up a folder from her desk and handed it to Rossi. "Your victim, Amara Jenkins," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "was approximately 8 weeks pregnant." The words landed in the sterile room with the force of a physical blow. Rossi stared at the report, the black and white text blurring for a second. Pregnant. A secret life, a secret complication, a secret motive. It was a tectonic shift, the kind of revelation that cracks a case wide open. The theory of a simple teenage argument escalating into violence evaporated, replaced by something infinitely more complex and dangerous. This wasn't just about a broken relationship. It was about a new life that had been extinguished before it could even begin. Davis let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Does the boyfriend know?" "That's our next stop," Rossi said, her mind already racing, recontextualizing every fact they had. The fight with Jamal, her recent withdrawal, her fear, it all took on a new, sharper meaning. A pregnancy could turn a teenage drama into a desperate, life-altering crisis. They drove back to the precinct in a charged silence. The case had been redefined. The stakes were higher, the potential motives darker. They brought Jamal Carter back into the interrogation room. He looked smaller than before, the 2 days in a holding cell having stripped him of his quarterback's confidence, leaving behind a tired, frightened teenager. Rossi decided on a direct approach. She sat down opposite him, slid the ME's report across the table, and watched his face. "Jamal," she said, her voice even, "we know Amara was pregnant." The reaction was not what she expected. There was no flicker of recognition, no flash of guilt or anger. Instead, his face crumpled in a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw went slack, and his eyes darted from the report to Rossi's face, searching for a sign that this was some kind of cruel trick. "What?" he whispered, the word barely audible. No, that's not possible." "Why isn't it possible, Jamal?" Davis asked gently from the corner of the room. Jamal looked down at his hands, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and pain. "Because we weren't," he stammered. "We haven't been together like that. Not for a few months." He looked up, his eyes pleading for them to believe him. "She said she wasn't ready to go further. She was focused on getting into Georgetown, and I respected that. We were taking a step back from the physical side of things, I swear to you." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't the feigned surprise of a guilty man. It was the gut-wrenching shock of a boy discovering a profound betrayal. The detectives exchanged a look. His story, as improbable as it seemed for a teenage couple, had the ring of truth. Then, the shock on Jamal's face slowly morphed into a dawning horror, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. His eyes widened. "If she was pregnant," he started, his voice trembling with the weight of the implication. "And it wasn't mine." He looked at them, his expression a mixture of grief and a terrible, newfound understanding. "Oh God, then who was it?" The question hung in the air, a mini-hook that was sharper and more dangerous than any they had encountered before. Amara Jenkins was pregnant, and her boyfriend was not the father. This revelation completely exonerated Jamal Carter in their eyes, slamming the door on the politically convenient theory and forcing them to turn back towards the place he had warned them about. The secrets weren't with the boy they had locked up. They were in that obsessively clean house with the performatively grieving mother and the unnervingly calm pastor. The father of Amara's unborn child was the real killer, or, at the very least, the key to finding them. And he was still out there. With Jamal Carter's innocence all but confirmed, the glaring inconsistencies in the statements of Brenda Jenkins and Pastor Marcus Thorne became impossible to ignore. The perfect alibis they had presented on the night of the murder now seemed less like truths and more like carefully constructed walls. It was time for Rossi and Davis to start knocking them down, brick by brick. Rossi, a detective who trusted paperwork more than people, started with Brenda. She drove to the Golden Years Assisted Living Facility, a sprawling, cheerful-looking building that smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. She found Brenda's supervisor, a weary-looking woman named Patricia, in a small, cluttered office. "Brenda is one of my most reliable CNAs," Patricia said, her brow furrowed with concern. "I can't imagine what she's going through. Such a tragedy." "I understand she worked a double shift on Tuesday night," Rossi said, keeping her tone conversational. "She must have been exhausted." Patricia frowned, tapping a pen against her desk. "Well, she was scheduled for one, but she asked to leave early." Rossi's senses went on high alert. Early? Can you be more specific? She clocked out at 8:45 p.m., the supervisor said, pulling up a digital timesheet on her computer monitor. The screen showed the entry in stark, undeniable black and white. B. Jenkins, clock out, 20:45. She told me she had a blinding migraine and was feeling nauseous. I've never known her to be sick, so I didn't think twice about letting her go. I felt bad for her. The timeline clicked into place with chilling precision. The ME had estimated the time of death to be between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. Brenda Jenkins, who had sworn she was at work until the following morning, had actually left her job just 15 minutes before that window opened. The lie was blatant, a gaping hole in her story. They brought Brenda back in. The transformation was remarkable. The weeping, helpless victim was gone, replaced by a woman whose grief now seemed brittle, a thin veneer over a core of simmering anger. Her eyes were hard and defensive. "I don't understand why I have to be here again," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm in mourning. You should be out there finding the animal who did this to my daughter." "We're trying to, Mrs. Jenkins," Rossi said calmly, sliding a copy of the timesheet across the table. "But we have a problem. You told us you worked all night. Your supervisor says you clocked out at 8:45 p.m. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Brenda stared at the paper, her composure faltering for a split second. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she quickly suppressed it. I was sick," she stammered, falling back on her original excuse. "I had a terrible migraine. I didn't want to worry you with the details." "So, where did you go after you left work?" Davis asked, his voice a low rumble. "I went to a friend's house, Sharon's, to pick up some stronger pain medicine she has. Then I went home and went straight to bed. The medicine knocked me out." The story was a patchwork of plausible excuses, but it sounded flimsy, invented on the spot. "We'll need Sharon's full name and address to verify that," Rossi said, her pen not moving from her notepad. Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something, after all I've lost?" While Rossi chipped away at Brenda's alibi, Davis focused his attention on the pastor. Marcus Thorne's story was more difficult to crack. His alibi witness was Elvin Hayes, a devout and widely respected deacon from his church. When Davis interviewed him, Hayes confirmed the pastor's story to the letter. "Oh yes, detective," the elderly deacon said, his hands folded peacefully in his lap. "Pastor Thorne and I were together in his office from about 7 p.m. until 10:30 p.m. We were studying the book of Job, a powerful lesson in faith during times of trial. We didn't even take a break." It was perfect, too perfect. Davis had been a cop long enough to know that real memories were messy. People forgot exact times. They got up to use the restroom. They took phone calls. The deacon's recollection was a flawless, verbatim repetition of the pastor's. It felt less like a memory and more like a rehearsed script. "And you were with him the entire time? For 3.5 straight hours, neither of you left the room?" Davis pressed. "The word of the Lord is captivating, detective," Hayes replied with a serene smile. Davis left the deacon's home with a gnawing suspicion. An alibi that perfect, from a man so devoted to his pastor, was almost worse than no alibi at all. It suggested a loyalty that might transcend the truth. He couldn't prove it was a lie, but his gut told him it was. Pastor Thorne was hiding behind his reputation, using his deacon as a shield. Back at the precinct, the two detectives compared notes. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. So the mother lied about being at work and invented a flimsy story to cover a 2-hour gap that falls right in the ME's window, Rossi summarized, underlining Brenda's name on their whiteboard. "And the father," Davis added, tapping his pen next to Marcus's name, "has an alibi so perfect it feels like it was written by a Hollywood screenwriter. His most loyal follower is his only witness." The foundation of their initial statements had crumbled. Brenda had lied about her whereabouts, and Pastor Thorne was hiding behind an alibi that felt manufactured. The mini-hook was sharp and clear. Why would a grieving mother lie about where she was on the night her daughter was murdered? The focus of the investigation had now swung decisively back to the two people who should have been protecting Amara. They weren't just grieving parents anymore. They were the prime suspects. The investigation, which had once been a torrent of shocking revelations, slowed to a frustrating crawl. They had suspects, they had motive, a secret pregnancy, a potential affair, and they had lies. But they had nothing to connect Brenda or Marcus directly to the murder. The case file was a collection of damning circumstances and gut feelings, none of which would stand up in court. The crime scene had been wiped clean with chilling efficiency. There were no usable fingerprints that didn't belong to the family. No murder weapon had been found. There were no witnesses to a struggle. They were standing at a dead end, staring at a brick wall of plausible deniability. The pressure from the captain, who was now dealing with the fallout from Jamal Carter's wrongful detainment, was immense. "You released the boyfriend, so who's next?" he demanded. "You can't just tell me you think it's the parents. Bring me something solid, or this case goes cold." The media narrative had shifted, now painting the police as either incompetent or prejudiced, or both. The community was on edge, and Amara Jenkins's name was becoming a rallying cry. Rossi and Davis felt the weight of it all, the frustration of knowing the truth was just out of reach, obscured by a wall of silence and deception. They re-interviewed neighbors, canvassed the area again, and went over the forensic reports for the 10th time, searching for a microscopic fiber or a misplaced drop of blood they might have missed. Nothing. It was during a late-night session in their office, surrounded by crime scene photos and empty coffee cups, that Rossi had the idea. It felt like a long shot. A desperate Hail Mary, pass in the final seconds of the game. "We've been focused inside the house," she said, staring at an aerial photo of the Jenkins property. "We've searched every inch of that place. But what about outside? What if the killer dropped something or hid something in the yard?" "We did a grid search, Rossi," Davis reminded her, his voice heavy with fatigue. "The uniforms spent hours out there. They found nothing but grass and a few garden gnomes." "Humans did a grid search," she countered, a spark of energy returning to her voice. "Humans get tired. They miss things. Their eyes can be deceived. But a dog's nose doesn't lie." Davis looked at her, understanding dawning on his face. "You want to call in the K9 unit." It was an unconventional move for a scene that was now more than a week old. Any scent trails would be long gone, washed away by the Georgia rain and baked out by the sun. But they weren't looking for a trail. They were looking for an object, something that might have the lingering scent of blood or fear or death. The captain was skeptical. "A dog? Now? You're grasping at straws, detective." "We've got nothing but straws, Captain," Rossi shot back. "Unless you have a better idea, I want that yard searched again, and I want our best dog on it." Reluctantly, the captain agreed. The next morning, they returned to the Jenkins house. The yellow crime scene tape was gone, but the property still felt haunted, a place frozen in the moment of its trauma. The air was thick and humid. Officer Henderson, the K9 handler, arrived with his partner, a magnificent German shepherd named Rocco. Rocco was the best cadaver and evidence dog on the force, a focused, intelligent animal whose sense of smell was a finely tuned scientific instrument. They started with the house, just in case. Rocco moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, his nose twitching, sampling the air. He showed a passing interest in the bathroom, the source of the strongest lingering scents, but gave no indication of anything new. Disappointment began to set in. It was, as the captain had said, a long shot. Then they moved outside. Henderson gave Rocco the command, and the dog began his work, moving in a crisscrossing pattern across the front lawn, then the back. He swept past the neatly trimmed hedges, the flower beds where Brenda Jenkins had planted marigolds, the small concrete patio. Nothing. The minutes stretched into an hour. The sun beat down, and the hope that had flickered in Rossi's chest began to dim. Davis watched from the porch, his arms crossed. He wanted this to work, for Rossi's sake and for the case's, but his pragmatic side was already preparing for the inevitable letdown. And then it happened. Rocco was near the back of the yard, close to an ancient sprawling oak tree whose thick branches provided a canopy of shade. Suddenly, the dog stopped. His posture changed, his tail went rigid, and a low whine escaped his throat. He circled the base of the massive tree, his nose pressed to the gnarled bark. Then he began to bark, a sharp, insistent sound that shattered the morning's quiet. He pawed frantically at one spot on the trunk, a section where the bark was loose and peeling. "What's he got, Henderson?" Rossi called out, her heart starting to pound. "He's got a strong hit on something," the handler replied, trying to calm the excited dog. "He's alerting. There's something here." The mini hook was the sound of that bark, a beacon of hope in a dead-end case. The human eye had seen nothing but an old tree, but Rocco's nose had detected a secret that was hidden in plain sight. They had been searching for a needle in a haystack, and a German shepherd had just led them right to it. The question now was, what secret had Amara, or her killer, thought was safe under the silent watch of the old oak tree? The world seemed to shrink, focusing entirely on the spot at the base of the ancient oak tree where Rocco continued his frantic signaling. The lazy morning hum of cicadas, the distant traffic, the oppressive weight of the Georgia heat, it all faded into the background. All that mattered was the dog's insistent bark, a sound that promised a breakthrough. Officer Henderson gently pulled Rocco back, praising him for his work, while Rossi and Davis converged on the tree. At first glance, it looked like nothing, just the thick, deeply grooved bark of a tree that had stood in this spot for a century or more. But where Rocco had been scratching, a section of bark seemed unnaturally loose. Davis pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and used the prying edge to carefully work it into the crack. With a soft, splintering sound, a large piece of bark came away, revealing a dark, hollowed-out cavity within the trunk. It was a natural knot in the wood that someone had clearly enlarged, a perfect secret hiding place. Rossi aimed her flashlight into the darkness. The beam reflected off something metallic. A wave of adrenaline, sharp and electric, shot through her. "There's something in there," she said, her voice tight with anticipation. Reaching into the hollow, his large hand barely fitting, Davis's fingers closed around a cold, rectangular object. He pulled it out into the daylight. It was an old, rusted biscuit tin, the kind a grandmother might have used. Its cheerful painted flowers were faded and peeling, a stark contrast to the grim context of its discovery. It was sealed shut with a thick layer of duct tape, now brittle with age and exposure to the elements. A reverent silence fell over the small group as Davis began to work on the tape with his knife. Each rip of the adhesive sounded like a gunshot in the quiet yard. This box held a secret, one so important that it had been hidden away from the world. Was it something Amara had hidden? Or was it something the killer had concealed after the fact? The possibilities raced through Rossi's mind. Finally, the last piece of tape gave way. Davis lifted the lid, the hinges creaked in protest, and a musty, earthy smell wafted out. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like old, dried leaves, was a single object, a cloth-bound journal. It was small and unassuming, its dark blue cover worn at the edges. A simple elastic band held it shut. This was it. This was the turning point they had been desperately searching for, the piece of the puzzle that Rocco's incredible sense of smell had unearthed. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the secrets it held. Davis carefully lifted the journal out and handed it to Rossi. Her gloved fingers trembled slightly as she took it. This was Amara's voice, her final words, her hidden truth. This journal could explain the pregnancy, identify the father, and point them directly to the killer. Or it could be nothing, a collection of teenage poetry and daydreams. But somehow she knew it wasn't. The care with which it had been hidden suggested its contents were explosive. "Let's get this back to the lab," Davis said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the excitement that was coursing through them both. "Let's see what secrets Amara wanted to keep." As they walked back to their car, leaving the forensic team to process the tree in the tin box, Rossi clutched the journal to her chest. It was a tangible link to the victim, a voice from beyond the grave. The investigation had been revived. The dead end was now a wide-open path, and it had been revealed not by a high-tech gadget or a brilliant deduction, but by the instinct of a dog and the timeless desire of a young girl to hide her most precious secrets in the heart of an old oak tree. The mini hook was the journal itself, a silent, mysterious object promising to unlock the entire case. The bark of the dog had led them to a box, and the box had given them a book. Now, they just had to read the story it was waiting to tell. And they had a chilling feeling that the story would be far darker and more twisted than anything they had imagined. Back in the sterile confines of the forensics lab, the blue journal felt like a sacred artifact. The air was thick with a tense, expectant silence as Rossi carefully removed the elastic band and opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was neat and precise, the elegant cursive of a girl who excelled in school. It was Amara's voice, clear and unfiltered, speaking to them from the other side of an unimaginable tragedy, and the story it told was devastating. The early entries were filled with the typical anxieties and aspirations of a bright teenager, frustrations with school, dreams of attending Georgetown Law, and musings about her relationship with Jamal. She wrote about Jamal with affection, but also a sense of distance, describing him as sweet and a good guy, but lamenting that he didn't really see the person she was becoming. But then, about 3 months before her death, the tone of the diary shifted dramatically. A new character entered the narrative, a person she referred to only by a single initial. M. September 12th. One entry read, M told me today that I have an old soul. He said I understand things most people don't. He really listens to me, not like he's waiting for his turn to talk, but like my words are the only thing that matters in the world. When he looks at me, I feel like I'm finally visible. It feels so wrong, but I can't help it. It's like a fire I can't put out. Rossi and Davis exchanged a look. Monsieur Marcus, the pastor. The cold dread that had been a low hum in the background of the investigation now became a screaming siren. They kept reading, the story unfolding page by page, each entry a step further into a dark, forbidden world. September 25th, Amara wrote. We were in his study at the church. He was helping me with my college application essay. He put his hand on mine and told me I was destined for greatness. I've never felt so special. I know he's my mother's husband. I know what this makes me, but I think I'm falling in love with him. He said my mother has never understood him, not really, but I do. The entries grew more intense, chronicling a secret, passionate affair unfolding under the noses of everyone who knew them. It was a relationship built on stolen moments, secret conversations, and a dangerous combination of teenage infatuation and predatory grooming. Marcus had preyed on her intelligence, her ambition, her desire to be seen as more than just a kid. He had made her feel like his intellectual and emotional equal, a confidant, a partner. Then came the entry that made Rossi's blood run cold. October 10th. The test was positive. I saw the 2 pink lines and I thought my life was over. I was so scared. But when I told M, he didn't get angry. He held me and he smiled. He said it was a sign from God. He said it meant we were meant to be a family. He said we would run away together. He has money saved, enough for us to start a new life somewhere far away. Mexico, maybe. He called our baby a miracle. Our miracle. There it was. The confirmation of the pregnancy and the identity of the father. It was her own stepfather, Pastor Marcus Thorne, the pillar of the community, the man of God. He hadn't just been having an affair with his teenage stepdaughter. He had gotten her pregnant and was planning to abandon his wife and church to flee the country with her. The final entries were filled with a frantic, nervous energy, a mix of fear and exhilarating hope. They detailed the escape plan. Marcus had purchased bus tickets to a border town in Texas. He had been quietly liquidating his assets. Amara had been slowly packing a hidden bag. The very last entry was dated the day of her murder, October 21st. Tonight is the night everything changes. M is picking up the last of the cash. The bags are packed. But there's one last thing I have to do. M wants me to just leave a note for Mom, but I can't. That feels like a coward's way out. She deserves to hear it from me, face to face. She deserves an explanation. I know she'll be angry, she'll be heartbroken, but she needs to know that I'm going to be happy. I'm going to have a family. I'm going to tell her tonight when she gets home. I pray she understands. I have to believe that a mother's love is bigger than her anger. Rossi closed the journal, her hands shaking slightly. The book felt like a live grenade. Amara's final words were a chilling premonition of her own death. She had planned to confront her mother, Brenda, on the very night she was murdered, the same night Brenda had lied about being at work. My God, Davis whispered, his face a grim mask. She walked right into the storm. The diary was the key that unlocked everything. It explained the pregnancy, it gave them the father, and it provided the catalyst for the murder. It wasn't a crime of passion between teenage lovers. It was a tragedy born from a monstrous betrayal. Amara hadn't been killed by a jealous boyfriend, but by a collision of forbidden love and a mother's unimaginable rage. The mini-hook was the devastating final entry. Amara's plan to confront her mother was, in essence, her own death sentence. The diary had given them the why. Now, armed with the victim's own words, it was time to confront the two people at the heart of this darkness and tear their web of lies apart for good. The aura of sanctity that clung to Pastor Marcus Thorne was a powerful shield. It was built on years of Sunday sermons, community leadership, and a carefully cultivated image of unimpeachable piety. But as he sat in the cold interrogation room for the second time, that shield was about to be shattered. This time, Rossi and Davis weren't coming with questions. They were coming with answers. Rossi placed Amara's diary on the metal table between them. She didn't open it. She just let it sit there, a silent, damning witness. "We found your stepdaughter's journal, Pastor," Rossi began, her voice cold and devoid of any deference. "We know everything." Marcus looked at the journal, and for the first time, the mask of calm detachment cracked. A flicker of pure, unadulterated panic flashed in his eyes before he quickly regained his composure. He clasped his hands on the table, a parody of prayerful contemplation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his resonant voice strained. "The fanciful writings of a teenage girl." "Don't," Davis cut in, his voice a low growl of contempt. "Don't you dare disrespect her memory like that, not after what you did." He leaned forward, his presence filling the small room. "We also have the DNA results from the fetal tissue. Congratulations, Pastor. You were going to be a father and a grandfather, all at the same time." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His shoulders slumped, and the last of his righteous facade crumbled away, revealing the weak, pathetic man beneath. The pastor was gone, replaced by a cornered predator. He looked from Davis to Rossi, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. He broke. The confession came not in a torrent, but in a slow, seeping leak of self-pity and blame-shifting. "I loved her," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand. She was so bright, so full of life. She saw me in a way Brenda never has. She wasn't a child. She was my soulmate." "She was a child, Marcus," Rossi snapped, her disgust palpable. "She was your 17-year-old stepdaughter, and you were supposed to protect her. Instead, you poisoned her life." He flinched at her words, but continued, the story tumbling out. He admitted to the affair, the pregnancy, the meticulously planned escape to Mexico. He painted himself as a man swept away by a force he couldn't control, a victim of a love that was preordained. He deflected and justified, claiming Amara was the pursuer, that she was wise beyond her years, that their connection was something pure in a world that wouldn't understand. It was a sickening performance, but the detectives let him talk, guiding him through the timeline of the final day. "So, you were planning to leave the night she was killed," Rossi stated. "The bus tickets, the cash, it was all ready." Marcus nodded, his head bowed. "Yes, we were going to leave after Brenda went to work. Disappear. But Amara had other plans, didn't she?" Davis pressed, his voice like iron. "She wanted to talk to her mother first." This was the crucial point. This was where the pastor's selfish actions intersected with the final, violent moments of Amara's life. Marcus looked up, his face slick with a sheen of sweat. "I tried to stop her," he said, his voice rising in desperation. "I begged her not to. I knew what Brenda was like, her temper, her jealousy. I told Amara to just write a note, that it was safer that way. But she was stubborn. She was honorable." He choked on the word. "She said she couldn't just vanish. She said she had to explain it to her mother face to face. She insisted on it." He paused, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "She was going to tell Brenda everything as soon as she got home from work that night. I was scared. So I went to the church. I went to my Bible study with Deacon Hayes, just like we always do. I couldn't be there for that conversation." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Marcus Thorne hadn't laid a hand on Amara that night. He hadn't strangled her or fought with her. He had done something far more cowardly, and perhaps more sinister. He had lit the fuse on a powder keg and then walked away, using his deacon and his Bible as an alibi, while the girl who was carrying his child faced her enraged, betrayed mother alone. He had not only failed to protect her, he had actively abandoned her to the fury he knew was coming. He hadn't committed the murder, but he had handed Amara a death sentence. The mini-hook was this chilling revelation of his cowardice. His alibi, which had seemed like a shield, was actually proof of his guilt in a different, more profound way. He had saved himself and sacrificed the girl he claimed to love. The saint had fallen, and in his fall, he had pointed the finger directly at the final and most violent actor in this tragedy: his wife. The final confrontation with Brenda Jenkins was like standing in the calm before a hurricane. When they brought her into the interrogation room, she was back in her role as the grieving mother, her face etched with sorrow and exhaustion. But this time, there was no sympathy in the room. There was only the cold, hard weight of the truth. Rossi and Davis didn't sit down. They stood, creating a subtle but unmistakable wall of authority. On the table between them, they laid out the evidence like a funeral shroud. A copy of Brenda's fraudulent timesheet, a still image from her neighbor's security camera showing her car pulling into the driveway at 8:58 p.m., Pastor Thorne's signed confession detailing the affair, and Amara's diary, open to the last fateful entry. Finally, Rossi placed a small evidence bag on top of the pile. Inside was the lab report detailing the DNA analysis of the skin cells found under Amara's fingernails. "The game is over, Brenda," Davis said, his voice flat and final. Brenda stared at the items on the table, her eyes darting from one piece of evidence to the next. The facade of grief began to crack, the sorrow in her eyes replaced by a hard, defensive glare. "I don't know what any of that is," she said, her voice trembling, but this time with rage, not sadness. "You left work at 8:45 p.m., Rossi began, ticking off the points with clinical precision. "You were home by 9 Skivur, just as your daughter was preparing to confront you. We have your husband's full confession about his relationship with Amara and their plan to run away. We have Amara's own words, describing how she was going to tell you everything that night." Rossi paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle in the silent room. She then slid the final evidence bag forward. "And we have this. When Amara fought for her life, she scratched her attacker. The DNA under her nails is a perfect match. To you." That was the breaking point. The carefully constructed dam of lies and denial burst, and what poured out was not grief, but a torrent of pure, undiluted fury. The transformation was terrifying. The small, weeping woman vanished, replaced by a figure contorted with a rage that seemed to make her physically larger. "She betrayed me!" Brenda shrieked, slamming her fist on the table. The sound echoed in the small room. "My own flesh and blood, in my own house, with my husband." The confession, when it came, was not a whisper of remorse, but a scream of justification. "He was my husband. I took him in, I gave him a family, a home, and she, my baby girl, she stole him from me." Her voice was raw, her eyes blazing with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. She stood there in that hallway, so smug, and told me she was pregnant, with his baby. She said they were in love, that they were leaving to be a family. She told me she was finally going to be happy, away from me. Brenda was reliving the moment, her words painting a vivid, horrific picture of Amara's final hour. "She mocked me," she hissed, tears of rage, not sorrow, streaming down her face. "She said I was old, that Marcus never loved me, that I was smothering her. She said her child would never call me grandmother. She described following Amara into the bathroom, the argument escalating, the words becoming weapons. I just wanted to make her stop, to make her take it back, Brenda sobbed, her body shaking. I saw the bronze statue on the shelf, the one the church gave us for our anniversary, an award for our perfect family. I picked it up, and I hit her. She looked at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time. I didn't mean to kill her, I just wanted to shut her up, but she fell, and she looked up at me with such disappointment. And then I don't know what happened. All the pain, all the years of sacrifice, all the betrayal, it just came out. My hands were on her throat, and I couldn't stop squeezing. I just wanted to squeeze the lies, the betrayal, out of her. The room was silent, save for Brenda's ragged breaths. The truth was finally out, uglier and more brutal than they could have imagined. This was not a simple act of passion. This was a murder born of narcissistic rage, of a mother who saw her daughter not as a child to be loved, but as a possession that had been stolen and a rival who had won. Davis read her rights, his voice a somber monotone. As they led a now sobbing Brenda Jenkins from the room, she was no longer a monster of rage, but a broken, pathetic woman, stripped of her justifications, left with only the devastating reality of what she had done. She had murdered her own child. The climactic reveal was complete. The final piece of evidence, the DNA, had forced a confession not of guilt, but of rage, exposing the true, horrifying motive behind the murder. The case was closed. In the end, justice, as it so often does, arrived not as a triumphant victory, but as a somber, procedural conclusion to an immense tragedy. The legal system, with its methodical and dispassionate logic, took over. Brenda Jenkins, faced with an insurmountable mountain of evidence, was convicted of first-degree murder. Her defense attorney's arguments of temporary insanity and a crime of passion were swept aside by the prosecution's portrayal of a murder fueled by narcissistic rage and followed by a calculated, cold-blooded cover-up. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend the rest of her days in a concrete cell, haunted by the face of the daughter she had killed. Pastor Marcus Thorne's fate was a different kind of damnation. He was never charged in connection with Amara's murder, but his sins were brought into the harsh light of day. He was convicted on multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor. The community he had once led, the congregation that had hung on his every word, turned on him with a righteous fury. His name was stripped from the church he had built. He was no longer a pillar of the community, but a pariah, a symbol of the deepest hypocrisy. His prison sentence was a formality. His true punishment was the complete and utter destruction of his life and legacy, a fall from grace so absolute that it was a story whispered in cautionary tales. A month after the sentencing, Detectives Rossi and Davis found themselves driving past the Jenkins house. A "for sale" sign was staked in the overgrown lawn. The windows were dark and empty. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, a silent monument to the family that had imploded within its walls. They pulled over to the curb, the engine idling quietly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The case was over, the files closed, the conviction secured. It was a win by all professional metrics, but it felt hollow. "We did our job," Rossi said finally, her voice barely a whisper. She was staring at the old oak tree in the backyard, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. "Yeah," Davis replied, his gaze distant. "We did." He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "You know, for 25 years, I've seen the worst of what people can do to each other. Strangers, enemies, rivals. But nothing is ever as ugly as when a family turns on itself." This case, they both knew, would stay with them. It was a stark and brutal lesson in the terrifying alchemy of human emotion. It was a story about how love, when twisted by obsession and possessiveness, ceases to be love at all. It becomes a cage, and when that cage is rattled by betrayal and jealousy, it can explode with devastating force. The lesson from the tragedy of Stone Mountain was not a simple one. It wasn't just about the danger of secrets or the corrosiveness of lies. It was a more profound and painful truth, that the very people who are supposed to be our greatest protectors can, in a moment of weakness and rage, become our destroyers. Brenda Jenkins had loved her daughter, in her own smothering, proprietary way. But her love for herself, for her pride, and for the life she believed she was owed, was stronger. Marcus Thorne had perhaps felt something he mistook for love for Amara, but his selfish passion and profound cowardice were the catalysts that set the tragedy in motion. In this story, there were no winners. There were only victims. Amara and her unborn child were the most obvious, their futures stolen in a paroxysm of rage. But Brenda, trapped in a prison of both concrete and regret, was a victim of her own uncontrollable fury. And Marcus, stripped of his dignity and freedom, was a victim of his own moral depravity. As Davis put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, a light rain began to fall, washing the dusty streets but doing nothing to cleanse the stain of what had happened. Justice had been served, but the tragedy remained, a permanent scar on the community, a heartbreaking reminder of how thin the line between love and hate can be, and how easily it can be crossed, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake.